Okay, let me welcome all of you again to the fifth webinar that we are organizing on the world without a WTO. We've had four very interesting webinars, and I'm going to tell you about the key takeaways that came up, and you could react to some of them other than the issues that we have asked you to speak about. First is, as an aftermath of the COVID-19 pandemic, a new world is going to unfold. We don't know as yet how it would look like in the future. Multilateralism per se is under a very serious threat. For example, the latest move by the US to withdraw from the World Health Organization. The question is how do we deal with this threat when it is needed the most? And even in the WHO context, it becomes much more critical considering this pandemic that we are facing with. Now, in terms of the trade and economic world, the WTO is in a ventilator and it has to come out of it. A more pertinent question may be that given the dysfunctional state that the WTO finds itself in today, what would happen to the world as a whole, not just trade? We may witness a deep recession, including a food crisis. We have to keep working on ending this pandemic, including a Marshall Plan kind of an approach to help particularly the poorer countries in the world. From our experience of past disruptions, the world will recover when the global trading system recovers. Recent drop in imports to China is much more alarming than the decline in exports that they are witnessing. WTO can bring back order to a chaotic world. As a result of this COVID-induced disruptions, the rules-based and open multilateral trading system will be even more challenged. There has to be a balance between market access needs and regulations related to ensure safety and security for consumers. More important, induced distortions to trade, we are now witnessing physical obstruction to trade. This calls for a new global initiative by recalling the birth, the genesis of the GATT in 1948. The Western powers will have to take this initiative and countries like India will join in with full vigor. It is time for a new global compact. A new equilibrium of accommodation of various interests has to emerge, and that will depend on existing and emerging power relations among major players. In order to preserve global peace, we have to encourage trade. We've always known that trade promotes peace. I've seen many nations which have been fighting with each other. Ultimately, they have stopped that kind of peace. The fundamental threat to the global trading system comes from the fact that the United States has lost its confidence in various phases of life, particularly cultural confidence. This came from Kishore Mahbubani, the famous political scientist from Singapore. As a result, the more China supports anything, the United States is expected to say no. It is also important to underline that this crisis of globalization is a result of inequalities, as hyperglobalization ignores the needs of the marginalized and the poor. This led to populism in various avatars, with shifting power dynamics within and across countries. The COVID crisis exposed the inherent contradictions in the WTO-led trading system, which was anyway asymmetrical. As a result, we are seeing increasing instances of export restrictions and also reshoring. The impact of this in Africa is and will be severe. We really need to interrogate the whole process of the functioning of the WTO. That will help us to have a better understanding of why there are so many systemic challenges. The rules-based multilateral trading system continues to be the best option. particularly for the developing and small island economies and landlocked countries as well. While the WTO is an improvement of its predecessor, the GATT, it is not a perfect system. The organization had and continues to face some significant systemic challenges. Most importantly, the recent trade disputes between major members have put considerable pressure on the system to function in a better manner. Without the WTO, developing and small economies will face more challenges, and it is this that forced them to call for reforms of the WTO by taking into account the current geopolitical issues. Furthermore, the COVID-induced crisis has challenged the confidence in cooperation which underlines trade. Not just decline in the volume of trade, we need to understand how that undermines the values of the multilateral trading system. This lack of confidence in global cooperation is worrisome. This is expected to get reflected in the future governance of the global health system, including how the expected vaccine to prevent COVID-19 is going to be administered. This is where the flexibility of the multilateral trading rules will be useful. We need to see how smoothly that is done. In short, we need to reinvent the WTO through structural transformation so as to derive better values out of it through a more balanced but faster decision-making process. This is an imperative in the post-COVID world. We need a better global leadership. Therefore, it is the responsibility of the middle powers, including India, to collectively provide a strong leadership for the resurrection of the multilateral trading system. They have done so in the past, and it is time for them to do it again. Therefore, let me conclude that other than debating this broader role of the WTO in underwriting security, peace, and prosperity, these webinars will discuss the following specific suggestions for trade multilateralism under the aegis of the WTO to reinvent itself in a new avatar. Number one, support for the multi-party interim appeal arbitration arrangement for settling trade disputes, unless the appellate body can be revived. Number two, revival of the built-in agenda of the existing WTO agreements by advocating for greater transparency in the functioning of the WTO's committees. And third, absorption of the values of the WTO agreement on trade facilitation for future multilateral negotiations. With that, let me welcome you all once again and request Anders Ahnlid, Ambassador of Sweden to Finland, as well as a very old hand on trade, and soon going to be the Director General of the National Board of Trade in Sweden. About 8 to 10 minutes, Anders.
Thank you very much, Pradeep, and thank you very much to you and CATS International for the invitation to participate in today's important webinar. And for me, as you indicated, it is a great pleasure to come back to global trade after a few years during which I've been concentrating on EU and bilateral Swedish-Finnish issues. You asked me, Pradeep, to talk about the role of middle-sized powers in generating consensus in the multilateral system, and I'll try to do so to the best of my ability, but permit me maybe first to make one or two more general comments on the unprecedented situation in which we find ourselves in due to the corona pandemic that you alluded to. And I must say that I really appreciated your introduction, and I can subscribe to almost everything you said there. Of course, when we talk about these matters, we have to keep in mind what the WTO is really about: to reduce poverty and increase welfare for citizens around the world through trade. And the WTO is intended to do so, of course, as you indicated, by providing the legal framework for trade and by improving trade openness through negotiations, by using reciprocity in negotiations to hitch the mercantilist tractor to the welfare maximizers plow, as Alan Winters once put it. While the WTO, to a not insignificant extent, still performs the first function, it is not able to deliver on the second, as you correctly alluded to, Pradeep, in your intervention. Ideally, of course, the corona crisis would be used to reboot the negotiating ability of the WTO in order to let further trade liberalization boost the crisis-ridden world economy and contribute to reaching the sustainable development goals. However, as you also alluded to, the present power structure in the trading system, including the US abdication from leadership and trade tensions between US and China, seems like to prevent such a positive scenario in the near future. A deals-based system that disregards the economic benefits of trade risks overrunning a rules-based and economically founded one. Trade wars are not good and not easy to win, as it were. It is essential to stick to the economic basis of the WTO based on trade knowledge about trade theory and how trade works in the real world in order to realize the benefits and minimize the cost of protectionist measures, the cost that these measures bring to societies. I think against this background, WTO remains the small and medium-sized developed and developing countries' best friend. This is why small and medium-sized powers still have a key role for seeking to regenerate consensus in the multilateral trading system. And it's worthwhile recalling, I think, looking back in history, that it has been this group that has been instrumental in first launching the successful Uruguay round in the 1980s. And it's this group of countries that has continued to be the best friends of the WTO since its inception, and as well before, during, and after now the negotiations on the Doha development agenda. So WTO members like Sweden and Finland, who have been posted, belong to this group, even if we nowadays pursue our trade policy through the European Union, which in turn is also, of course, fully committed to safeguarding the WTO and bringing the trading system forward. So an overall answer to your question, Pradeep, concerning the role of middle-sized powers in generating consensus, is that this group of countries has to stay the course, keep the sights steadily set on the goal of upholding WTO law and developing the trading system further through liberalization, despite the stormy waters that we find ourselves in. And since this group of countries can't contribute in terms of their market size alone, they have to find other means of doing so. And my country, Sweden, is active along those lines in a number of ways, and I would address some of them. First, within the EU, I think countries of our kind has an important role. Our trade minister, Sweden's trade minister, Anna Hallberg, has gathered a number of like-minded EU trade ministers, including, of course, Ville Skinnari from Finland, to muster and ensure support for the European Commission's continued work for open and sustainable trade in preparation for the delayed 12th WTO Ministerial Conference. The focus here has been on making sure that the WTO and trade policy does form part of the solution to the corona crisis, not least by contributing to better needed economic recovery. Specific objectives are WTO reform, of course, modernization of the WTO, using new measures in making business, with increased focus on, of course, sustainable development, including climate, gender equality, and digitalization, as well as progress in the ongoing negotiating files. And in this regard, plurilateral outcomes will no doubt be of importance, including as a means to use when parties agree to disagree on traditional global solutions. I think it's worthwhile also here to mention that my country has initiated the multi-stakeholder global deal initiative that is now has found its place in the OECD, but comprises 20 governments from both developed and developing countries, as well as a number of labor unions and companies, employers, organizations, in order to foster dialogue, consultations, and negotiations between governments, employers, and workers on the national level to promote sustainable development and make sure that the gains of trade are distributed in a good manner. A second way through which I think middle-sized countries can participate and contribute to consensus is the support given to trade through trade-related measures, such as the WTO Aid for Trade and Enhanced Integrated Framework, in order to make sure that developing countries gets their fair place around the negotiating table, not least. In 2018, my country, Sweden, contributed 3.7 billion Swedish crowns, about $40 million US, to the international Aid for Trade agenda, which in turn led to projects and measures being taken multilaterally, regionally, as well as nationally by governmental as well as non-governmental organizations around the world. In addition, we have founded Open Trade Gate Sweden, which assists developing countries when they export to my country, to Sweden. Third and finally, science-based knowledge, analysis, and well-thought-through proposals constitute another important means through which small and middle-sized countries contribute to the WTO. In the case of Sweden, my upcoming employer, the National Board of Trade, is an important asset in this regard, I believe. Recently, the board has published reports on topics such as rules of origin, country of origin labeling, trade and gender, trade and gender equality, and trade in the fourth industrial revolution. All worthwhile reading and contributing, I believe, importantly to the trade debate. And let me provide one final timely example through which countries of my size can contribute in relation also to the corona crisis. Within our European Union, Sweden has spearheaded the Aid for Health initiative. Our trade minister again, Anna Hallberg, launched the initiative before EU colleagues in April, and the Commission, as you might know, put forward its concept paper before WTO partners in June. The aim here, of course, is first to eliminate tariffs on pharmaceuticals and other relevant medical products, such as respirators, ventilators, masks, gloves, goggles, garments, and disinfectant products. Second, the initiative aims at improving disciplines to prevent undue export and import restrictions, not least against the background of the many export restrictions on critical goods that were launched at the beginning of the COVID-19 crisis. And along similar lines, of course, such an initiative would also be of importance when it comes to guaranteeing that the vaccine against COVID-19 is evenly distributed among countries once such vaccine is at hand. Finally, and unfortunately, the global coronavirus pandemic is far from over, as we can see. The number of victims is still increasing in too many countries around the world. So while we must all continue to keep our heads cool, our hearts warm, and our hands clean, we also have to devote, as you mentioned, Pradeep, in your intervention, considerable time and energy towards making sure that the WTO and the global trading system becomes part of the solution to both the pandemic and the ensuing economic downturn. The alternative would be far too costly for us all. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Anders. For an excellent set of comments that you made. I still remember that Sweden was probably ahead of the other Western countries in not being a member of the multi-fiber agreement also, for example, had exempted exports of that. So the legacy is quite strong. That may I now request Marion Jansen is the chief economist of the International Trade Center, which is a joint UNCTAD and WTO body. Marion, over to you. 8 to 10 minutes, please.
Thank you, and thank you for inviting me to this discussion. At the International Trade Center where I work, we have as a mandate to help small and medium-sized enterprises, so not small and medium-sized powers, but small and medium-sized enterprises to benefit from trade and from globalization at large. And you have invited me to say a few words on small and medium-sized enterprises and to connect that to the WTO. Now, first I was asked, why it's important to care about SMEs. I personally believe, and we believe at ITC, that's very important to ensure that small and medium-sized enterprises benefit from whatever trade rules we have in place, because they employ across the globe around 70% of the labor force. In some countries, it's 80%, in some countries, 65%, in others, 90%. But everywhere, the majority of the workforce is employed by small and medium-sized enterprises. So if small and medium-sized enterprises do not take advantage of trade rules or of the multilateral trading system, then probably the majority of your population is not going to take advantage. And therefore, small and medium-sized enterprises are entities we have to care about. Now, I will invite you to think about the WTO, the multilateral trading system as it is, through the lens of an SME for the next 5 minutes. And for this, we may have to think a bit out of the box. I've worked for the WTO for many years. I'm a conventional trade economist, so I'm used to thinking traditional trade theory and WTO rules. But let's try to go a step back and look at WTO rules and how they are implemented from an SME point of view. And maybe that kind of aspect will help us to think about this new design of the multilateral trading system that Pradeep was making reference to. Now, we expect the WTO, the multilateral trading system, to bring a transparent trading system, non-discriminatory, and rules-based. So I would like to ask under 5 points whether from an SME point of view, the system is transparent, non-discriminatory, and rules-based. 5 points. First point, is it transparent? Now, most SMEs, in particular in developing countries, will find it very hard to find information and to understand the information that is relevant for them to trade, that comes out of the WTO. Because even though we think it's transparent, those of us who work within this system, that doesn't mean that the information is either technically or understandably accessible for small enterprises. This is an issue that has been identified also by the informal working group on small and medium-sized enterprises at the WTO. And together with the WTO, the UNCTAD and ITC, we have been working on what is called the SME Trade Help Desk. It's a global platform that makes information on trade that is relevant for small enterprises available to SMEs in an accessible way. So they can understand what is the tariff that I would face when I send something abroad, what are the regulations, and what are the processes I will have to deal with. We have notably also adjusted information on that platform recently during the COVID-19 crisis in order for SMEs to know how COVID-19 is affecting them. So transparency, it's something that is being addressed, even though it hasn't been working ideally for many SMEs in the past. That was the first point. Second point, a rules-based system. Yes, there are many rules at the WTO, but they are being also monitored. There's a dispute settlement system around it. But how relevant is this for small and medium-sized enterprises? Well, many will find it's not very relevant for them. The rules that are relevant for them are notably written in the contracts that they sign with other companies. And here I'm thinking of value chains and SMEs signing contracts with multinationals. It is well known from our own research, but also from the research, for instance, from the International Labour Office, that SMEs often find it hard to sign contracts that make sense, that are good for them with multinationals. They simply don't understand what they should be aware of when they sign a contract. And then if there is a dispute, if there is an issue, they will go to a commercial court. They will go through the commercial dispute system and not through the WTO system. Now, it happens that during COVID-19, a lot of things did not go well with these contracts. Suddenly, lead firms did pull out of contracts that were already signed, or they received goods and didn't sign them, so they didn't pay them, they didn't stick to the contracts that they had signed. So many SMEs, in particular in the emerging world, have found themselves without payments, without contracts, and having the feeling that whatever rules-based system may exist in theory, it's not working for them. And there are a number of initiatives now trying to address this to ensure that in the future, in a crisis situation like the one we have been facing, all players along the value chain stick to what has been agreed in existing contracts. And that's dispute resolution systems are in place that protect SMEs. I'm wondering whether we should start to think about legal connections between a WTO dispute settlement system, a rules system, and a commercial system. If trade agreements now make reference to e-signature templates from UNCTAD, why couldn't they make reference to templates being used by international commercial dispute settlement systems? This is something that could legally be possible and that could maybe make SMEs more protected. So I mentioned transparency, I mentioned rules-based system. Looking through an SME lens, I will make 3 points on non-discrimination. Do SMEs in the world feel that the non-discrimination rules in the multilateral system function for them? 3 examples where maybe they do not feel it's working. When it comes to border crossing, trade facilitation is meant to make it easier for all players to cross the borders. But in many countries, we encounter fast lanes that make it easier for large traders to get through the border. SMEs are sometimes de facto discriminated against because they are too small, less important. At ITC, we have been insisting at the country level for trade facilitation measures to be applied at the same way for small and large enterprises. And we believe that this is very important. Non-discrimination should also work when it comes to trade facilitation. Another point on non-discrimination. Well, when it comes to trade, we may have certain rules imposed by a multilateral system, but other issues that are important for globalization, for those international rules do not exist. And here I'm thinking of taxation. International trade rules make reference to you shouldn't imply taxes or subsidies in a way that discriminates. But when it comes to taxation schemes, to shifting profits from one country to the other in order to pay lower taxes, that's something that large enterprises have been able to do, but small enterprises can't. When you look at the de facto tax burden, it's higher on employees and on smaller enterprises than on large enterprises. We are starting to address this. There have been movements in this direction since the financial crisis. I'm notably thinking of the OECD rules on taxation, but this is a matter that is important for SMEs and that will become very important in the next years as governments are finding their pockets empty after the COVID-19 crisis. Now, how taxes are applied differently across countries, how transfer pricing is measured, that's not something dealt with by the WTO. Maybe it shouldn't. But if those rules are discriminatory, if taxation is discriminatory, it will affect competitiveness of SMEs, and it will affect the perception of SMEs of how globalization is working for them. Trade negotiators have to think of finance and have to create links in one way or the other. Not everything has to be dealt with by the WTO, but the different systems have to be coherent. And my last point also goes to the balance between large and small. The entire system, the entire concept of the WTO, of the multilateral trading system, and of trade being beneficial to all is based on the idea, on the assumption that we are working within competitive markets. Where markets are determined by market power, and that's a lot the case in some of the new markets. I'm thinking here of the entire digital economy. Where there is market power, openness will not necessarily lead to benefits for all. We need some type of rules around competition policy. And that's an issue that has escaped the WTO for long. It is not being discussed at the WTO anymore. There are different views of how and whether it should be brought in. But for SMEs, it will matter how this issue is dealt with in the future. So these are 5 points, one on transparency, three on non-discrimination, and one on the rules-based system, where an SME point of view may give us a different angle to look at the WTO, and where maybe that point of view is something we may take into account if and when hopefully we go into a design of a new, better, stronger and sustainable multilateral trading system.
Thank you very much, Marion. That was a very useful intervention by you. And in particular, you're right. I mean, as SMEs, they tend to get discriminated against within the country's boundaries itself, because they don't have that kind of heft, as it were, or muscles. Now, having said that, I just wanted to make a few house announcements before I invite the next speaker. I wanted the crowd to go. Any questions that anybody may have, could please use the chat function given below and pose the question, type in their question, and we'll take it up as and when we are able to proceed further in this series. Now, what we have done is we've divided this webinar into two sessions. The first session is going on, and the last speaker in the first session is Bernard Hoekman, who I will request to speak as soon as I finish this. The other three speakers have already been mentioned on the flyer, which you may have seen, or the announcement, except that Mina Mashayekhi had to pull out at the last moment, and hence she sends her regret for this. Let me invite Bernard Hoekman. Bernard is an old friend also. He's professor and director of global economics at the Robert Schuman Center for Advanced Studies at the European University Institute in Florence, Italy. Earlier, he used to work with the World Bank, the Development Research Group, as the director of the International Trade Department and research manager. He's also worked in the GATT Secretariat in the past. So he's also sort of quite hands-on in terms of the issue that we're going to discuss. Over to you, Bernard.
Thanks, Pradeep. So it's great to be part of this conversation. So I'm going to basically talk to the questions that I was asked to speak on, and essentially those are three. One is why address systemic issues. Second question that I was asked to speak on is how do we go about this? And the third question, what kind of reforms are needed in the WTO to actually deal with the how, and how far away are we from actually being able to do what kind of conceptually is needed to achieve the many things that Pradeep kind of mentioned at the beginning of this conversation as to where we need to be going. Now, what I'm going to be speaking to is based on a pretty large research program that I've been involved in over the last couple of years or so, which has been supported by the Bertelsmann Stiftung in Germany. And you can find quite a few papers on the website of the EUI, but also on the Bertelsmann Stiftung website. And I will also briefly speak to some of the results that came out of a recent survey we ran of trade policy officials and practitioners, which is also summarized in a working paper, which you can find on the EUI website, and which is actually quite interesting. So I'll highlight a few of the things that come out of that survey, because they actually do suggest that there is quite a bit of work to be done in both dealing with specific issues, but also in dealing with some mindsets that may in fact inhibit kind of moving forward in the direction that we might all agree we need to move on. So why address systemic issues? That was the first question. And in answering that question, you first have to kind of identify, what are we talking about? What are systemic issues, right? And I think this is actually a very important question. I'm not going to have a lot of time to address it, but if you go back to what Marion was talking about, SMEs, right? And you ask yourself, of all those things which are clearly important for small firms, how much of that is actually of a systemic nature? How much of that is something where the WTO should, or multilateral institutions should engage on? And I think this is a question we have not been asking ourselves collectively enough. And it boils down to, what actually is the comparative advantage of multilateral cooperation, and where can it actually help move the needle to address problems which a government cannot resolve, or which the individual management of a firm cannot resolve, or which a collection of firms working together cannot resolve, right? And I think a lot of the issues that have come up and that are very important from a development point of view, from a growth point of view, are really issues that have to be dealt with nationally, and that can and should be dealt with by firms working together. So then the question for us then becomes, to what extent should we be dealing with those issues in an institution like the WTO? Right now, that's of course a topic for another session, or 6 or 60, but I think it is an important issue because there has been a tendency, I would argue, of overloading the WTO with issues where the WTO really doesn't have a comparative advantage, where we should not be asking trade ministers to talk about these issues because they don't have the instruments to address them, right? So that is one. So if I think about what are systemic issues, I would argue they really have to do with policy actions taken by countries which create large negative spillovers on other countries. That's one way of thinking about what is systemic. Another way of thinking about systemic is to ask the question, where are the market failures? And that is kind of related to the spillover question, but not necessarily. So some of the things Marion was talking about, information, for example, there is an information problem. Is there a scope for an institution like the WTO or another type of mechanism to actually identify what is good practice, right? And I think where we need to make a much greater distinction is between policies that create large spillovers and this issue of knowledge, information, what actually makes for good practice. How should we deal with many of the issues that Marion mentioned on SMEs? So what's the best way of doing this, right? So this is more pragmatic, nuts and bolts type of things. I wouldn't regard that as systemic, but it is clearly important. But I think insofar as we're dealing with spillover issues, we need different approaches in terms of cooperation than if we're dealing with information problems, if we're dealing with learning problems, if we're dealing with what makes for good practice. So what are the big systemic issues confronting the WTO? I would argue on the spillover front, this clearly has to do with what large countries do, because small countries cannot affect what goes on in world markets. They can affect world prices, they're price takers. Increasingly, that is an agenda that revolves around subsidies. Right now, of course, COVID has made every country a huge subsidizer insofar as they can afford it. Most developing countries cannot. Most of the large subsidies are being implemented by large countries. Therefore, those subsidies will have effects on world markets. They will have effects on competition. So there we have clearly one area where there are significant, which is systemic in nature because of the spillovers. Climate change is another one, right? So climate change is, of course, an example of a global market failure. And what the World Trade Organization membership needs to figure out is, how does trade policy fit into the actions that governments have agreed to take to reduce carbon footprints to deal with climate change, right? So that's clearly, again, a big systemic issue. I would argue that's there. The third systemic issue I would just highlight is the sustainable development goals, right? Development in general. How do we use the trading system to promote development? And I think that is a subsidiary question because it really relates to how do we deal with these spillover types of questions. So why address these? Because they create large negative effects on other countries, right? So there's a clear incentive for cooperation there. Question number 2 then is how to go about doing this. And I think here again, whether we're thinking about the role of the system in terms of promoting and identifying good practices, or we're thinking about the role of the system as a way of internalizing the negative effects of what governments do on other governments, we need to know what we're talking about. We need to identify what the effects are of policies. So I think that's the first element of answering the how question. We need to identify which of these different types of policies that are argued to create spillovers actually do. How large are they? What's the incidence? What's the distributional effects of those policies? So that requires deliberation. It requires analysis so that we can actually learn about this. And I think here there's clearly, I would argue, a pretty big gap between what we would need and what we have today. The WTO Secretariat is increasingly muzzled in terms of its ability to do analysis. It's also restricted in its ability to collect information on what governments do. Yes, we have the trade policy review mechanism, but if you look at the reports that are generated by the WTO, let's say on subsidies, there is a big gap between what we're getting out of the WTO process and what independent outfits like the Global Trade Alert are documenting with respect to what governments are doing. A second element of the how is to encourage, especially the large countries that are creating the spillovers, to talk to each other in Geneva, right? And there again, that is something that isn't really happening. So part of the how has to revolve around addressing that issue. And I think that first step has already been taken in terms of promoting the use of plurilateral initiatives where groups of countries take up issues, as was mentioned by Anders and by Pradeep. That is something where you need leadership. The leadership is coming mostly from middle-income countries. In this regard, we're not seeing India at all in this process. We're not really seeing China take the lead in any of these areas. China is often part of these groups, but I would say there's a big gap in leadership. And we see it clearly, I think, if we're looking at COVID. We look at countries like New Zealand and Singapore, which have done all the right things, have taken initiatives, created an open plurilateral agreement with respect to personal protective equipment, medicines. No one has joined that initiative. Not the EU, not the US. We don't expect the US to join anything at the moment, of course, but not the EU, not any of the large countries, not India. So I think we have a big problem here in terms of how, and I think that is a challenge. And that leadership dimension is really important. And then the question becomes, where does leadership come from? The leadership comes from politics and political economy, right? So that means where are the large firms? And again, the SMEs, of course, are very important in terms of employment, but they're not particularly powerful in terms of domestic politics. So where are the large political forces that are going to induce leaders to actually engage? And I think that's something else that has been missing. Okay, third question, because I don't want to speak for too long. What kind of reforms are needed in the WTO? And here I can go on forever. So I'll just highlight some of the things that are clearly important, because Pradeep also asked me to speak to what is kind of immediate in terms of what the next Director General is going to have to deal with. So one, and this is very clear also from the survey, right? So we had around 1,100 people who opened the survey. We had a bit over 800 who answered most of the questions. And the number one issue that comes out for everybody is deal with the dispute settlement crisis in the WTO, right? So either make the appellate body operational again or reform the system so that we actually have a functioning system again, right? And some categories of respondents make absolutely no distinction between those two. So for them, clearly what matters is to have a functioning dispute settlement system. One of the interesting things that came out of the survey is that people in Geneva, officials in Geneva, put much less weight on dispute settlement reform and much more weight on bringing back the appellate body, right? So essentially, it's almost like it's semi-lexicographic. We need the appellate body, and that's really what they're focused on. And I think one of the challenges for the next DG is going to be to kind of recognize that insisting on bringing back the appellate body is unlikely to be a particularly successful strategy. There actually are issues that need to be addressed in dispute settlement. Marion had some examples. So I think we really need to kind of deal with what are core problems. How can we come up with a better system that works more efficiently and that actually deals with some of these sovereignty concerns that have been expressed by the United States. Now, there's lots of things to unpack on dispute settlement reform. I've been doing some work with Petros Mavroidis on this, and one of the things we argue is that one of the reform items really has to be to mandate and require any adjudication system to admit when there is no law or not enough law, when it's unclear, right? So throw things back to the membership. That is something which really isn't there at the moment. And I think we could, we can have a discussion about whether the appellate body overstepped its mandate in dealing with particular issues. But anyway, that has to be, I think, an element of the reform. Second item is this whole, and this also comes out of the survey as the number 2 priority, which is trade policy monitoring, notification, what is going on in the world. And here it's quite interesting that especially respondents in Africa actually put that as number 1. That's the number 1 priority. And I interpret that as saying they are quite worried about what the EU, the US are doing in terms of responding to COVID because of the potential negative effects on them, and they cannot do what the big countries are doing. Now, that then relates to this question of how do you collect the information? And I think one of the reforms here has to be, and this is a challenge, I guess, again, for the next DG, is to allow the Secretariat to collect information from wherever they can find it. So instead of relying only on notifications by members, use the information that is out there. The ITC collects a lot of this information, the World Bank collects a lot of this information, the Global Trade Alert collects a lot of information. So we need to bring that all to the table, and we need to encourage that that type of information gets used. I think that's another element of reform. And part of that reform can actually be done through leveraging the committees, right? A lot of that discussion can and should occur much more in WTO committees. That's where the relevant officials are sitting. So again, we need to support that process. Part of supporting that process is to open it up, right? So that it's not just government officials who are sitting there, that we also have the business community, that we have regulators, that we have the people who are actually involved in those policies as part of the discussion in the WTO. A lot of that discussion can happen virtually. We're all here on Zoom. There's been a big resistance among some WTO members against this. We also find this again in the survey, especially Geneva-based delegations who are not all that enthusiastic about doing things through Zoom, and they're even less enthusiastic about decision-making if not everybody is in the room. I think that's something that really has to change, right? And you can do this through thematic sessions of committees. You can do it by accelerating and putting more weight on special trade concern type of mechanisms. Robert Wolf, who is part of this project on WTO reform that I've been involved in, he has a bunch of papers on this. So those of you who are interested in that can read his work. I think there's a lot of sensible recommendations there. Final area of reform is on development. Right, and I think this is a perennial problem and has been a perennial problem for the WTO since its inception. I think with the trade facilitation agreement, there really was a shift in mindset. And I think we really need to build on that in order to actually deal with development the way it should be done, which is to focus on what are the constraints to actually help countries adopt what everybody agrees are good practices, as opposed to the old-fashioned approach that says, oh, we'll give you exemptions. We basically don't care what you do. You can rot in your own environment until you become big enough for you to become a problem for us in terms of creating a spillover, and then we'll engage, right? So I think it's been quite a negative approach that has been pursued. I think it's logical. We can understand why it is, but I think the TFA approach in terms of defining a system where you actually help countries get to where everybody agrees we need to be is the right way to go. So let me stop there. I've probably gone on way too long. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Bernard. That was, again, very excellent set of remarks on the basis of the work that your institute has been doing, as you spoke about. Now, I've got as I said earlier, this webinar has been divided into 2 sessions. We have the 2 of the 3 other panelists already with us, Carolyn and Pasi. I'll come to them later. And another, for about 10 minutes, we'll answer take a few questions and then switch to the second session. Now, question to Bernard, can you tell us the latest in terms of bringing back the appellate body? Why has there been resistance for virtual discussions from the delegates? My other question is on how to handle the security issues, especially when conducting negotiations. Bernard, would you like to shoot?
Just to clarify the security, you're talking about national security or personal security?
I think the security of being able to discuss through Zoom or virtually or what have you. I think that is probably what is worrying the delegates.
Personally, I think some of the delegates might be more worried about having experts from capitals deal with issues.
Right.
I think the security, I don't know anything about this, but I think the security aspects have been dealt with, right? So certainly Zoom is now a lot more secure. And anyway, so that's something we can deal with. On the appellate body, I think the dynamic has been very negative, right? Because the dynamic has been very much one of the US saying, we don't like what's going on, we're going to kill it. Right? And the reaction to that has been, well, we don't like this particular strategy. We may or may not agree with you that there are things that are fixable or that need to be fixed with the appellate body, but we're simply going to oppose you, right? So, and signal that what you're doing is unacceptable to us. And I think that's very clear in the proposals that have been made in the dispute settlement body, where a large majority of the WTO membership repeatedly said, we need to start the process of reappointing members of the appellate body.
Right.
So I think that dynamic has kind of kept people in a rut. I think the initiative by the European Union to create this interim arbitration process, the MPIA, gives again a very clear signal that those countries, they want an appeal system and they want it to be as close to what the appellate body was doing as possible, right? And again, that's understandable in terms of the politics of this, but I think it's really a missed opportunity, right? So I very much hope that looking forward, there's going to be a process where you actually have a substantive discussion on institutional design of the system, and where you don't take as given that what was concocted very quickly at the end of the Uruguay round, because the appellate body really has no institutional framework around it that was discussed by negotiators, to revisit that and to rethink how this thing actually should work. And we've not had that discussion in Geneva because the discussion to date that has been led by Ambassador Walker was to focus on particular things that the US had put on the table and not really focusing on the systemic question. What kind of dispute settlement system do we need? What are the key concerns we need to address? And I think that's something that still needs to be done. I fully understand that it was very hard to do because the US simply does not want to engage. But I think it is something that even without the US, that conversation should have been had, and it hasn't been had. So I think we've lost quite a bit of time that we should have actually been focusing on the substance of these issues.
Thank you, Bernard. A question for Anders. What impact do you see of the recent trend of digital services tax being imposed or likely to be imposed by France and many other European nations, including India, which the US claims unfairly discriminates against the US tech companies?
Yeah, Pradeep, it's a very good, is my mic on?
Yeah.
Yeah, it's a very good question. I now have to kind of confess that I've been away from this business for so long, so I haven't really followed this matter as I probably should. But it's no doubt a very tricky thing, not least given the fact that the tax issues are not maybe ideally handled in any international setting, and also in determining the trade effects of these matters in a trading area, which is also not really well covered by specific WTO rules. I cannot really go into these specific question without looking into it further than that. I'm sorry for that, Pradeep.
Not at all. But I thought it was important for me to raise it for the consumption of the larger audience. A question to you, Marion. Considering the complexity of multilateral trade negotiations at present, do you see the trend of the coalition of willing on, say, e-commerce, industrial facilitation, etc., to address some of the issues that you have raised in the context of MSMEs And also, how do we avoid the jurisdictional creep when we foresee the WTO addressing some of these issues that are purely private, commercial, or non-trade in nature? Over to you, Marion.
I would like to answer that question by going back to a big picture design and also to some of the issues raised in the previous questions. You asked the questions about the digital taxation theme.
Right.
Bernard raised the issue of COVID-19 subsidies that are being perceived as discriminatory by a lot of the developing world now. We are, with these questions, in this space that I mentioned in my first intervention, between the trade ministries and the finance ministries. And many of these matters are typically dealt with by the finance ministries, and finance is something that governments want to keep to themselves, that they want to maintain as a national matter. Yet, subsidies, as Bernard mentioned, can lead to important spillovers if markets are open. This is a fundamental issue that we have so far, as Anders said, not dealt with in an ideal way. And that hits us each time when we have a big crisis like COVID-19, a big crisis like the financial crisis, or a big market shift like the one in the digital space. There we have to go back to the drawing board and ask ourselves how we can deal with this interface between trade and finance in the future. And it's probably because of what Bernard said, that it's the big players who will ultimately have to find a way to deal with each other in these open systems. It's probably the big powers, those that can shift prices by their behavior, that have to find some type of agreement of how they want to go forward. That's one issue. Similar when it comes to law, private versus public law, commercial versus international trade law. I published at the beginning of 2017 a book with Joost Pauwelijn, the European candidate now for the interim appellate body. We said in that volume, we said if we don't find a way to deal with some of the incoherences in this international dispute settlement systems around international economics, and there are incoherences when you look at dispute settlement for investment, dispute settlement for trade, dispute settlement for taxation. These incoherences for ordinary citizens don't make sense. They can't solve these incoherences, but they see there is an issue. We as experts have to find a way to solve these incoherences and to make these systems fitting together. And this will include making the public and the private dispute settlement systems fitting together. I agree with Bernard, not all needs to be solved at the WTO or dealt with within the WTO. But we know from international legal systems that cross-references across agreements, across bodies do exist. And this is, I think, a solution we should think of for the future. So I believe that there are a number of big questions that need to be answered, that it would be helpful to look at these big questions from a distance, and that ultimately the big players will have to find a way to solve these big questions, but that maybe it's the middle powers, Pradeep and Anders, that need to start kicking off this process, because it's definitely of interest to all WTO members that we solve these questions.
Thank you very much, Marion. Now we start our second session with Carolyn Deere Birkbeck, who's a senior researcher at the Graduate Institute's Global Governance Center, where she conducts research on the politics and governance of global trade, environment, sustainable development, and intellectual property. Over to you, Carolyn.
Great. Thank you very much, Pradeep, and good morning, everyone. It's a pleasure to be part of this discussion. In my remarks, I wanted to underscore that the relevance and the credibility of the WTO relies on governments harnessing its processes and functions to find ways to better cooperate on two of the central challenges facing the global economy: environmental sustainability, and Bernard has already mentioned climate, and linked to that, achieving progress on the SDGs. And Bernard has mentioned that both of these are systemic challenges for the WTO. I also want to offer some specific recommendations for how the WTO can help governments better cooperate to align trade policy with these goals. So as many of you are aware, there are at least 28 SDG targets that are directly related to trade policy. But to date, there's been little focused effort by WTO members to work out exactly how they will cooperate through and at the WTO to advance their implementation. And meanwhile, as the international community responds to the climate crisis and the COVID-19 crisis, there are calls to build back better, to ensure that stimulus and recovery policies support the transition to a global economy that's both fairer and more environmentally sustainable, especially in terms of its carbon footprint. So in the trade policy world, building back better means focusing not only on a trade recovery, but on a global trade recovery that's just, that is, that it supports developing countries, especially the most vulnerable among them, and MSMEs, and it's also green. So looking ahead, building back better also means using this moment to spur a frame shift in favor of more proactively aligning trade policy frameworks and harnessing the WTO to more concretely support and promote a greener, lower carbon global economy, as well as progress on the SDGs. Now, of course, we're all aware that there's been 30 years of debate on trade and environmental sustainability at the WTO and elsewhere. There are ongoing debates on responsibility and burden sharing, and much of this focuses on 5 challenges: how to fairly distribute the economic costs of environmental action, how to ensure that trade-related environmental actions by some countries are not undermined by failures to act in others, how to ensure that companies and governments that do undertake green efforts do not lose out, but are rather rewarded in the global marketplace, and within that context, how to support developing countries to green their exports. And the 5th challenge has been around avoiding green protectionism. And developing countries have expressed important concerns about risk to their competitiveness and market access from trade policies demanding stronger environmental performance. They've expressed disappointment that more has not been done to ensure affordable access to relevant environmental technologies, to environment-related trade capacity building and finance, and to support more market access for sustainably produced exports. Many developed country governments have been discouraged by threats of trade sanctions to force improved environmental performance. And they also emphasize the historic responsibility of developed countries for environmental damage. And among developed countries too, there are tensions around variations in environmental standards and how these impact trade and competitiveness. But on the other hand, the trade, environment, sustainable development discussion has evolved a great deal over the past 30 years, as has the intensity and urgency of environmental impacts and risks faced by countries and businesses across the world. It's developing countries that are also suffering the most from the impacts of climate change, of biodiversity and natural resource degradation, pollution and desertification. Developing countries suffer economically and socially from these impacts and will suffer most from inaction. In the long run, these environmental impacts will affect their ability to produce and export sustainably. The immediate trade-related risks and shocks that LDCs and small islands face, for instance, from natural disasters such as floods, hurricanes, and droughts are enormous. So developing countries need help adapting and responding to these challenges in terms of technology, capacity building, and trade rules that accommodate and respond to the challenges they face. For this reason, a growing number of developing countries are allies in calling for environmental action, including in the trade arena, and for a fairer approach. Consumers, especially in developed countries, are now more fully aware of the ecological impact and carbon footprint of their consumption patterns, of sort of the global impact that they have in many parts of the world. And so they're calling for more sustainable global supply chains. That pressure is out there in global markets. And meanwhile, for business, the COVID-19 crisis has underscored the importance of supply chains that are resilient to shocks, including environmental risks and shocks. For this reason, a growing number of businesses are calling for environmental action in the trade policy arena. They're seeking transparency and predictability of regulatory frameworks, transparent and predictable markets for business that will enable them to boost their environmental performance, and also to ensure that their production and their trade is environmentally resilient, The International Chamber of Commerce, for instance, has highlighted the alignment of climate and trade policy as one of its top 5 trade priorities. So in short, we've got a far more nuanced debate than we did 30 years ago. And there's much more interest now in how and where trade can promote, challenge, or undermine environmental goals, and how specifically trade policy can be used to support environmental goals. But work at the WTO is out of sync with all of this. The discussion lags well behind the need for aligning trade and the critical importance of harnessing trade and trade policy to help with the SDGs. So looking ahead, in my view, we need for the trade environment policy discussion to go beyond the status quo. Now, the status quo is about trade policy keeping out of the way and accommodating legitimate, well-crafted environmental measures that align with core WTO principles. But looking ahead, we need to identify concrete ways in which trade policies, laws, and institutions can more proactively support and enable governments and businesses toward greater environmental sustainability. Now, much of the work has to be at the national level through improved environmental policies, laws, and enforcement. But there's also work to be done at the WTO. So for any meaningful movement at the WTO on environmental sustainability, a critical point is that we need to ensure that the priorities of developing countries are center stage and that they are allies in this effort. We need to intensify dialogue and action in ways that build consensus around concrete trade policy options. One that recognizes and addresses conflicts where they exist, that pursues green trade opportunities and uses trade to facilitate environmental progress. Part of this will require listening more and finding ways and processes through which we can listen more to scientists, to businesses, and to stakeholders that have direct experience and expertise on these issues. It may also require a multi-agency approach that brings the wider aid for trade community and agencies working closely with developing countries such as UNCTAD into a discussion on how we can boost the sustainability of trade. And it'll also need high-level political leadership and processes. We need a group of ministers from developing and developed countries to speak up and work together as champions of trade and environmental sustainability at the WTO and beyond. So what specifically could members do at the WTO? So the first is they can do better on the WTO's existing environment agenda. So top of the list would be a meaningful agreement on the removal of environmentally harmful fish subsidies in ways that accommodate the concerns of developing countries. Second, we need to ensure that environmental sustainability is a core priority in the wider WTO reform agenda and on the agenda of the incoming WTO Director General. So here, members could commit to reinvigorating and intensifying the work of the WTO's Regular Committee on Trade and Environment to give it a more central role in reviewing, supporting, and incubating a focus across the organisation on environmental sustainability. Notably, the online format of the latest committee meeting attracted much more capital-based engagement than is normally the case, and I think that's a very positive development if we can engage more regulators and officials within ministries, within national capitals. At WTO Environment Week, governments also regularly now host side events on issues of particular interest to them, which is a promising way to bring in expertise and experience of businesses, NGOs, and other IGOs. At the same time, we need to go beyond the CTE. Members should work to integrate environmental sustainability and resilience across all WTO negotiations. In this respect, we have an exciting, I think, new proposal from a group of WTO members called the Friends Advancing Sustainable Trade. They're calling for a ministerial statement on environmental sustainability and trade. And central to their proposal is the creation of a new informal working group that would complement and support the work of the CTE, which has only 2 formal meetings per year, by serving as a hub and a catalyst, an informal open setting for more focused, action-oriented dialogue, where governments could work together informally to build concrete initiatives that would help drive forward environmental sustainability at the WTO. Fifth, we could call on governments on the WTO to create an independent interdisciplinary panel that could advise and assess SDG impacts and opportunities related to the work of the WTO. That's in terms of the negotiations, but also other WTO functions, how it could help in terms of monitoring, policy dialogue, research, capacity building to support progress on the SDGs more concretely. And finally, members can continue to work on a number of very promising initiatives that they've already put on the table and that are of interest to both developing and developed countries. This includes specific discussion of ways that trade and trade policy frameworks could better support the circular economy and more sustainable production, efforts to reduce plastic pollution, trade in environmental goods and services, and especially for low carbon products, regenerative sustainable agriculture and food systems, and of course, climate action. On climate, there are numerous proposals for better aligning trade policy with the world's climate ambition in ways that are fair and that boost the resilience of trade. There are a number of topics that urgently demand discussion at the WTO. We could come back to those in the questions. And finally, there's the issue of greening aid for trade and trade finance in ways that better address the capacity constraints of developing countries, support green exports, and build resilience to natural disasters. So just to close, what is clear is that no country can address the environment trade challenges we face alone. And the environmental challenges at home are enormous and they have significant trade impacts. Members can and should lead by example in devising ways forward, but they need to work together to persuade and enable other countries to join them. On all of the environment and trade issues, finding approaches that are fair, effective, and that balance diverse interests will demand cooperation. And that can best be done multilaterally. And climate is the clearest case of this, where more active multilateral dialogue on how to move forward on this issue is urgently needed. Now, making these remarks, I'm fully aware of the political constraints facing the WTO at this time and the difficulties in reaching multilateral consensus on anything. But this is not a reason not to try and to try harder than before. We can't afford not to because it's urgent from an environmental point of view, and that makes it urgent also from an economic and a development point of view. If we fail to address these issues, all countries stand to lose. So in the COVID-19 context, amidst the recognition that we need to modernize the WTO and ensure its relevance to new challenges, amidst calls to build back better, and with the prospect of a new DG, we have a unique opportunity to put environmental sustainability and the SDGs higher on the WTO's agenda. The WTO is a unique multilateral forum where we can work to build shared understandings, trust, and cooperative solutions. And in that context, we need to hear more from developing countries, and specifically from middle powers like India, on their priorities and proposals for addressing environmental sustainabilities and wider SDGs issues at the WTO. We need their engagement in pushing for multilateral approaches and to underline that the WTO is a key vehicle through which we can promote multilateral action on trade and environmental sustainability that reflects the priorities of developing countries. Thank you, Pradeep, for the opportunity.
Thank you, Carolyn. Thank you very much. Pascal Lamy had also spoken about this particular issue in the first webinar that we held about 2 months ago. We've also been joined by Veena Jha, who would also speak about it. But Carolyn, just to tell you that, when you spoke about India as a country, let's not forget that it was a former Prime Minister of India who reminded the world that poverty is the biggest polluter. So when you talk in terms of, I know that overconsumption is creating a lot of problems, but the overconsumption is happening in the West, which is where more attention has to be given on trade and environment issues than in the South. South is still struggling, and in fact, what will happen as an aftermath of COVID-19 is further immiserization of countries. Treasuries are going to shrink very badly. Even India's economy is going to shrink by about nearly 4%. So that's going to be huge. But if you look at the other poorer countries, they'll probably be worse off than this. The important issue is that we have to be aware, and the fact is that it is not only COVID-19, but including all these cyclones which have been happening lately is a warning signal to the world that, look, start taking nature more seriously than you are, which means balance your consumption. Maybe we could think in terms of reviving the Commission on Sustainable Development to look at these issues plus the SDGs agenda and so on. With that, may I now turn to Pasi. Pasi is the Director of the Trade Policy Unit of the Department of External Economic Relations in the Ministry for Foreign Affairs of Finland. Another very old hand on trade and international relations, and another old friend. Pasi, over to you.
Thank you very much, Pradeep, and I hope everybody can hear me. You kindly asked me to talk a bit of the possibility for the WTO to address challenges related to the governance of global public goods. And I think it's a vastly complicated topic and not necessarily the one I was thinking about that I would be talking of. But I'll give it a try, and I'm sort of recognizing that I'll probably be scratching but the surface. Now, without going into too many definitions, I wanted to speak of global public goods as such as economic security, climate, environment, and public health, the last of which is very much on everybody's mind right now with the COVID-19. And there are other global public goods as well, including the WTO in itself, which as an international institution is a public good in its own right. Now, the WTO is primarily contributing to economic security. I mean, the WTO gives the global trade a rules-based framework that provides certainty and predictability for traders around the world. It's the body that oversees the administration of those rules, and there's a structured mechanism to address the occasions when the rules are not followed by members. The economic security fosters peace, as you yourself put it, and that's another global public good. Now, while the WTO is not entirely global, as there are some countries still outside of it, it's clear that its rules cover most of the world trade. And the overall track record of the WTO is pretty impressive, in my opinion. I mean, the GATS WTO system has overseen 70 years of economic growth, increase in global wealth, improvement of living standards, and a huge reduction of poverty through consequent rounds of liberalization in the conditions of trade. It is now in difficulties, but in historical terms, it has served us well. And it's not perfect, as many others have pointed out. But to quote a long-time ardent WTO critic, if the WTO did not exist, we would need to invent it. For some other global public goods, WTO is not necessarily the key institution to provide them, but perhaps a best supporting actor. I mean, on the environment, on climate change, health, labor, there are other institutions that are far more pertinent. And I mean, in the past, at least, the members have been really careful that even if there are clear trade dimensions to many of these topics, these are mostly dealt with outside the organization. Now, is it possible for the WTO to address these sort of challenges? Now, in my opinion, the WTO could and should have a role. I mean, the WTO is having a role already. I mean, if you think of the fisheries subsidies negotiations, these are a topic it's immensely complicated when we look at the texts and all that sort of thing. But in terms of economics, it's totally negligible. It's massive on the sustainability part of our planet and its biodiversity. I mean, it's one of the sustainable development goals is the healthy marine environment. And if we fail to observe a commitment about attaining that SDG, it may sound a technicality, but a failure to manage fish stocks in a sustainable way is an existential threat for all of us. Now, the WTO is the place where these negotiations take place. It's up to the members to deliver a result. There's no other platform for it. Carolyn spoke earlier of the sustainable development side and how that could be further integrated into the world of trade. And I will not go into it, but it would seem that it's it's an important topic also in the sense that the world community would see that the WTO is relevant for today's global challenges. And as she mentioned already, one simple way of how the WTO could contribute to climate change mitigation would be to start discussions on the liberalization of trade in environmental or versus climate-friendly goods and services. Now, in terms of public health, the WTO delivered already in the early 2000s when the members agreed on the modification of the TRIPS agreement to ensure access to medicines in public health crises for those countries that would not be able to produce a crucial medication at home. Now, some people may find that it was perhaps not a global public good per se, but as it concerned mainly those most vulnerable. But I think what happened was that it was a global public good in the sense that it showed that trade rule making was not standing in the way of pursuing legitimate public policy goals. Can we do something else in terms of public health at WTO? We shall see. The COVID is a serious economic and societal crisis, but I find the trade policy response has been mostly rather measured. I mean, there have been import restrictions on export restrictions on medication and protective equipment, yes, but many countries have also introduced trade facilitation measures to help the circulation of goods. By and large, there seems to be a recognition that an open, interconnected system is more resilient in a global health crisis than a closed one. Can this crisis be an opportunity for the WTO? I certainly hope so, because there seems to be a demand for a trade and health initiative, and there's right sort of music in talks and declarations. Anders alluded to some proposals by Sweden and the EU, and of course there are the proposals, as Bernard was mentioning, of Singapore and New Zealand. Whether we can pull something off in the WTO, it would not only contribute to a provision of a global public good, i.e. health, but it would help to uphold the institution that we attach great importance to. And the real test, as some others mentioned, for the trading system may just be behind the corner. I mean, once the COVID-19 subsides, will we return to business as normal, or do we start erecting borders? The risk of countermeasures is evident as the trade, if the trade distortive parts of national rescue programs are not dismantled. And if that happens, that will slow down the recovery and erode the stability of the multilateral trading system. Of course, the WTO is not the only international institution facing headwinds today, as Pradeep and others have pointed out. But whether the WTO can be part of the solution, it's the members that need to walk the talk. Instead of the lip service, we have to agree on ways forward. And it seems, I mean, several others have spoken of the need for reform at the WTO, and some have pointed the several obvious ones in their presentations. I mean, from my side, I would probably highlight the negotiations function, especially in needing for some sort of refurbishing, even if the administration of treaties and dispute settlement require also attention. I mean, on the negotiation side, we have to accept that the rule book dates back almost 40 years, and I mean, there are institutional reforms we can undertake, and we could look at the various proposals that Pradeep and other eminent persons did in 2013, when there were proposals about the Secretariat being given a greater role in tabling, negotiating proposals, collecting and verifying notification data, monitoring, all that sort of thing. And I think that was also mentioned by by other speakers. And there are other things the members could do. And one, I think, important thing that hasn't, well, did touch it. I think it merits emphasizing is the plurilateral discussions. I mean, if the WTO is to remain the central forum for trade negotiations, it should be that both for multilateral and plurilateral negotiations. It's beneficial for the institution that the WTO serves as the basis of the negotiations. Even those opposed to plurilateral initiatives should accept that the alternative erodes the multilateral system much more profoundly. I mean, negotiating within the WTO strengthens the institution and its legitimacy. In the absence of real progress multilaterally, open plurilaterals ensure that, in part, that the WTO remains relevant for global trade as a whole. Case by case, this can be done with MFN. One could call it sort of flexible multilateralism. It doesn't mean that we shouldn't try to make progress on multilateral front as well. Agriculture, for instance, is an area where it would be very difficult and very disingenuous to try to agree bilaterally or regionally on some of the disciplines. But it's an area where members need to focus on, as the agri-trade rules also have repercussions on issues such as food security, which is also characterized by some as the global public good. I thought it was an interesting idea that was in the flyer, that we should look at the trade facilitation agreement as a guidance for further multilateral work. I'm sure we could use some of the best practices therein to enhance the uptake of new commitments by members. I mean, the wider the uptake of new equal commitments among membership, especially among major players, the better it is for the international trade community. On dispute settlement, the present situation is far from ideal, and the fact that there's no valid instance of appeal is contrary to the letter of the DSU. There's an interim alternative in town in the form of the multi-party arrangements. Some of the participants of the MPIA are seasoned users of the dispute settlement system, and some that are there have never used it. It's too early to say what sort of dispute settlement results we will have with the arrangement, and I for one hope to see the regular mechanism reinstated rather sooner than later. While I agree with Bernard that there's a need to look into how the design needs to be rethought. In the absence, the MPIA serves to uphold the two-step dispute settlement. It's not just for safeguarding members' rights in an extraordinary situation, it's for maintaining of the institution. And it can even help to some extent diminish the need for unilateral activism. It would be very important that further members sign on to it, and I think that would include India as well. The headline of the webinar was "A World Without the WTO." Now, the WTO architecture will not go away. Everything else, bilateral, regional, plurilateral, is based there, but it's as good as the members allow it to be. The GATT WTO was and is based on a common understanding of rights and obligations. Now, every member should do their share for upholding that balance. Major players have, in all honesty, a bigger duty. The GATT WTO was also based on an idea that there are clear benefits in opening up of markets, lowering of barriers, and fostering exchange between members. I think that needs to be rediscovered, and I think that some others have pointed that as well. Finally, global public goods need collective action, as Joseph Stiglitz put it, and we have the WTO as the forum to provide it. Thank you.
Thank you, Pasi. Thank you very much for your very useful intervention. May I now request Dr. Veena Jha. Veena is, I think many of you would be knowing her. She's an economist with decades of experience advising governments and international organizations on trade and development issues. She has a PhD from University of London. Other than that, she's published various books and 13 books and 50 papers. She's currently based in Geneva and India as the Chief Executive Officer of IKDHVAJ Advisors, LLP, whose partner is her life partner, Dr. Harshvardhan Singh, former DDG WTO. Over to you, Veena. 8 to 10 minutes, please. Veena, I can also tell you that you missed Bernard's presentation, but he also spoke about the deliberative agenda of WTO being a very critical one, so that appellate body doesn't start defining the law of the WTO rather than the deliberative, the committee should deal with it. Over to you, Mina.
Thank you very much, and good afternoon, everyone. Can you hear me? Can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you.
Okay.
I can hear you. Yeah, the others are on mute, Veena.
Okay, fine. I might be repeating some of the things that Bernard said, because some of the recommendations are from the Bertelsmann Committee. But nevertheless, the major role of the deliberative agenda, as you call it, is through the committees of the WTO. And the committees of the WTO have three functions, essentially. One is discussing and transparency. The second is monitoring functions. And the third is to solve trade-related concerns without litigation. So basically, the committees reinforce the function of the WTO, and it heads off disputes before they escalate to formal disputes, and it alleviates some of the pressures on the legal system. Now, the committees can work on issue by issue, or there can be cross-cutting committees like the Trade and Development Committee or some other committees of the WTO, including the RTA and including the TPRM. These three committees deal with cross-cutting issues. And what is very important is that they can deal with several issues which fall within the remit of the other committees. Obviously, the importance is to ensure transparency and regulatory outcomes. But the problem with the committees is that though it encourages widespread participation, very often some of the countries are not able to participate. And so democracy is not absolute, as should have been the case with the committee members. Also, there has been a call by a Canada-led group to revive what is called the deliberative agenda through the committees to avoid the dispute settlement mechanism. And for that, they are feeling that there is a need to strengthen the committee process. The only problem that arises is the expectations from the various committees, as well as the priority areas that should be reformed or strengthened, are very different between different groups. For example, some members are emphasizing the need for strengthening multilateral structures and return to normal working procedures, whereas others are saying, no, let's deal with the fourth industrial revolution and not with the normal things. Then Africa, for example, would prefer to go back to the Doha Development Agenda, something that many have discarded. And the WTO, whether it is positioned to deal with the new technological developments and the Chinese role model of the economy, which was earlier supposed to be a market economy, but now 15 years have passed and people have still doubts about it. These are some of the expectations that we don't know anything about. which points to the fact that any meaningful WTO reform cannot be expected soon. And global trade structures are in a very transitory phase. So what can we do? The first thing is, in the committees, the positive part of the committees is that they do not need permission to improve their own procedures. They can go ahead and do it with all the membership present. So they do not need US authority or Chinese authority or any other authority to do so. Only General Council guidance and central decision on how to incorporate all the members are needed. So in that sense, it's a very powerful mechanism for reviving the WTO. And it's a very powerful mechanism for implementing a lot of the agreements of the WTO and even pushing forward new issues. To give you just an example, the specific trade-related concern, or STCs that they are called, have been flagged in the TBT and the SPS committees. And there have been about 34,000 such notifications. And there have been only 6 disputes in the which have gone to the appellate body. Similarly, in other committees from October 2018 to October 2019, there were more than, not more than 10% of the total deliberations or total disputes, so to say, have actually gone to the dispute settlement bodies. So what can we do to make these committees more effective? First is that participation and agenda is largely driven by a few member countries. And I'm not distinguishing between developed and developing over here. I would say large trading partners. So that has to be more democratized. Then this is the first thing. The second is resources are really limited because capacity constraints exist, and tabling a paper in the committee is quite a challenge because you have to have a thorough knowledge of the WTO. You have to have a thorough knowledge of what you want. Your industry has to support this paper. And there are several stages of government clearance that has to be gone through to table a paper in the committee. Even a notification takes a long time. And all these could be fast-tracked and some assistance could be provided to do so. Then the thing is that any outcome, if not MFN, then the differential rate, for example, if there are plurilateral outcomes from these committees and it is not extended to all the members, then that could cause a bit of a problem with the democratization of the process. And while facilitating partnership and while facilitating trade and involvement of the committee members can be encouraged, there's a long way to go before it can become totally democratic. Some housekeeping tips: scheduling of the meetings can be arranged well in advance, advanced documentation, written questions and answers should be encouraged so that all WTO members have access to it. Virtual participation should be encouraged, especially in these COVID times when so much of WTO's regular work takes place through virtual participation. There's no reason why other countries which are not able to come cannot do it. Then on specific trade-related concerns, there should be an integrated database, and better facilities for delegates to promote work should be there. There is also one essential thing. We have absolutely no knowledge about what has been the resolution of concerns through those committees. Because as I said, that so many concerns have been raised and so few went to dispute settlement, but we need a documentation of how those concerns were resolved, because that essentially lays the foundation of pushing the WTO agenda further. And we also need a detailed record of all the trade interventions. And we also need a kind of an STC, specific trade-related concerns, in the annual report of the WTO. So these are some of the housekeeping things, but I think the most important issue is how to enhance the usefulness to their constituency. the information needed to enhance their relevance, and whether trade measures have helped economic development or not. The previous speaker spoke so much about poverty alleviation, etc. But what we know about poverty alleviation is that over 40 years, yes, poverty has gone down, but inequality has increased. And this is perhaps at the basis, not only intra-regional inequality or intra-country inequality, but interstate inequality. That means inter-country inequality has increased. And the WTO has often been held responsible for this, rightly or wrongly. And what is very important, therefore, is to focus on this issue a little more, that how has inequality been exacerbated by the WTO mechanism, and whether these issues can be taken up in the relevant committees. Now, the most important committees which have been studied so far is the Trade Policy Review Mechanism Committee and the RTA Committee, and the subcommittee on RTAs, which has been reported a lot and studied a lot. Now, TPRM is exactly the mechanism that countries can use to either advance their trade agenda, also checkmate protectionism in a major way. But it has no teeth. So what can be done to give the committees teeth is also something that needs to be discussed. And the reform agenda of the WTO to make it more inclusive, how can it be furthered through the committees is another issue that needs to be understood. Transparency is one issue, and transparency is a very important issue. But what type of authority would we need to translate transparency notifications to, let's say, a non-binding regulation? That becomes very important. And also, how can we get more expertise on the issues of the committee? Because apart from a few organizations, such as the IMF, most of the organizations are not allowed to participate in the committees. And could, for example, TPRM be discussed in the countries concerned instead of just the WTO? And could those then have a much more public interaction than just in the WTO? And also, do we need an external assessment of the committee's work in order to pinpoint strengths and weaknesses, and for a more informed decision? What can be done in specific committees in terms of mandates and procedures? And how can the setup and support be improved for the committees to address new issues and challenges related to the respective topics? These are some of my thoughts on this, but I would also like to reflect a little bit on what would be the interface, because the committees are at the second and third and fourth level. In fact, the third and the fourth level of the hierarchy of the WTO decision making. So do we need an intermediary, for example, between the committees and the General Council? And can these initiatives, can some of the grassroots innovative and deliberative committee work, can it find itself in the General Council? Some of the proposals go to the General Council, which would then not be concerned with minute questioning, because that process would have already been taken over by the committee. So an additional issue is that the committees seem to be facing a lack of participation of senior diplomats. And how can one incentivize them to participate in this and move one step further so that all the discussion takes place in committees? And this is largely because the committees don't need a mandate. They have the existing mandate of the WTO to propose agendas and to go forward. So that was my thinking on the deliberative agenda of the WTO. Pradeep, did you want me to also reflect on what was said by Birkbeck and by Carolyn and Pasi?
Yeah, yes, please.
Okay. So just Carolyn had a very meaningful, and so did Pasi, have a very meaningful presentation on trade and environment. Now, as this was my beat several years ago, I just want to reflect on two issues. One, the COVID times will lead to an increase in protectionism all across the world. It has already been found, and people are trying to use trade restrictions to protect their economies. So to add one more issue in the agenda of trade protectionism, in my view, is not warranted, because there will be enough coming from other areas like local content, etc., which will be very, very important. And also, most economies are trying to revive themselves after COVID. I do not think that it be a priority, though it should be one, to go into SDGs, etc., because just now economic growth and poverty alleviation would be the most important priorities of governments, and that would require a very concerted effort and would stretch government resources to the ultimate. So just what I'm trying to point out is that perhaps this is not an appropriate time to talk about trade and environment issues, however important they may be, because recovery from COVID for the economies, no matter how long it lasts, will be a very important issue. However, the same does not apply to trade and health issues, because one of the, and here lies the conundrum, because one of the important instruments that countries have used, especially producing countries, to protect their economies, large producing countries such as India and to some extent China, have been export restrictions on, for example, antiretrovirals, which is used as a treatment for COVID cases. Of course, India lifted that sanction, that export restriction which he had at the US's request, and was able to deal with it. But this is a real crisis of multilateralism, because if countries have to deal with their own economies with very limited resources and very limited drugs, wouldn't it be natural for them to restrict the trade in these products, which also uses kits and masks and many other issues, which are many other issues related, many other products and diagnostic kits related to the COVID crisis. Now, in this particular case, to impose WTO restrictions, when clearly WTO does have a health provision under TRIPS, but not under other agreements of the WTO, would actually be quite counterproductive, because then countries which would be inclined to respond to a global good would be less inclined to do so, and it would erode the system a little more. On this issue, I would also like to say that plurilateral negotiations, even on trade and health, would probably be the way to go. The only thing is to provide all the benefits to all the members may not be possible in this particular environment. So COVID has thrown up a situation which will challenge many of the established orthodoxies, if you wish, of the WTO on national treatment and MFN. And to ensure that particular challenge is met, I agree multilateralism is the way forward. And I also agree that multilateral cooperation on drugs, vaccines, etc. is the way forward. But the most important issue is, what do we do in the WTO context? I'll leave it at there, Pradeep, and see whether there are any questions.
Thank you, Veena. There's one question to you before I move on to the other panelists. As you're aware, that small countries have hardly any strength in their delegations. So how do you think they can be, assisted in the committee meetings, which we've seen quite often?
I think the way to go. Can you hear me? The way to go is the way to go for small countries would be through formation of groups, so that they can kind of rotate between them to be represented in the committees. The other issue would be, actually giving them technical assistance to formulate proposals which are of use to them. The enhanced integrated framework and the aid for trade framework could be used for this purpose. So far, it's only been used for developing the capacity of countries to trade, but there's no reason why it cannot also be used for encouraging their participation in the committees. Now, a participation by itself is not very meaningful, but to raise concerns is very meaningful. So when these countries have concerns, they can raise it in a group, they can raise it through writing in the WTO, even if they are not present, or they can raise it through video conference. So these are the three mechanisms that could be used. The most important, I think, gap in this whole thing is that do they have enough technical expertise to formulate a proposal? And there, I think the EIF should be able to help them.
Thank you, but even UNCTAD is helping them other than many other NGOs.
Yeah.
We've seen a huge progress since the time when the WTO was formed in '95.
Yes, that's right.
Carolyn, you have a minute? Before I go back, you made a specific request.
Yes. Oh, is it for me now?
Yeah.
Yeah. Great. No, I just wanted to respond quickly to your comments and those of Veena. Of course, I completely appreciate that COVID has changed the context, and I understand the argument that for developing countries, issues of poverty alleviation are critical, and that and that poverty is something that impacts the environment directly. However, I think that we really need to acknowledge that for many LDCs, and particularly for small island states, environmental impacts are immediate and now, and they impact their trade. They impact their ability to produce for export because they're changing production conditions for agriculture and something. It's not an abstract issue, it's an immediate issue that they have environment-related impacts on their trade, and they need help to have those addressed. So my point was not here to burden developing countries so much with more and say it's for them to be bearing the cost of all of this environmental action. What I'm saying is we need developing country voices to push for action internationally, to push developed countries to do what they need to do, and developed countries' supply chains to do what they need to do in ways that support developing countries and export opportunities from developing countries, and that are fair and transparent. We can't pretend this conversation doesn't need to happen. I mean, the marketplace, that consumers are demanding greener supply chains and greener production. So we need to make sure that the standards and rules and initiatives that developed countries are pursuing are done so in a way that supports developing countries in this, and that provides them or supports them to develop the appropriate innovation, technology, and export opportunities in that. I think the key thing there too is that there are opportunities for developing countries. I mean, I was thinking last week we're in a discussion about plastics. Alternatives to plastics and substitutes is something that developing countries like India, Pakistan, and Bangladesh have specialized in for years. You have all kinds of natural-based alternatives to packaging, for example. So we should be looking for ways to promote these as industries of developing countries that are green. But anyway, just to say, my point was not to say that we, the point is to burden, to say there are economic opportunities in this, and there's a need for developing countries to ensure that their opportunities are not constrained by approaches to the environment that don't account for their circumstances.
Thank you, Carolyn. Now, I have two questions to the panel. One is based upon the discussion that Carolyn just spoke about, and Veena also. The US is not a party to the Climate Change Convention, among other international regimes. So how do you think you can progress this kind of agenda in a way that even there, any kind of agenda, any international agenda which can lead to larger welfare of people? For me, it's very complex and very difficult. Kishore Mehbubani at this series of webinars also spoke about the fact is that post-World War II, America was very generous, and that is what they did, in terms of setting up these institutions and multilateral institutions, IMF, World Bank, etc., etc. But today under Trump, it is, make America great again, and they are slowly withdrawing from all global affairs. WHO is the latest victim. Then comes to my second question, all of you speak about democracy and transparency and non-discrimination and so on. Now, I'm told, and if I'm mistaken, please correct me, but the WTO has a rule of majority, except that by convention, they have adopted the principle of consensus rather than talking about majority. So how do we, do you think that is democratic? or is it like another United or UN Security Council where one nation has a veto power? Therefore, what has been happening is the appellate body is a classic example of one country holding the whole system hostage. Thirdly, I mean, we also wrote about, I and Pascal Lamy also wrote a joint article when we spoke about the fact is that we can look at WTO without the US. If we want to progress here, I mean, there are, as I said, there are many other international regimes where the US is not a party and is not even willing to look at it in a serious way. So may I turn to Anders?
Well, is my mic on? What happened now? Sorry. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Can I be heard? Can you hear me?
Yeah, we can hear you.
Okay, great. No, on the US situation, of course, it is in a way, tragedy that the founding nation, the former hegemon, has basically abdicated from taking its responsibility in global trade matters in the way that we've seen. We don't know what happened after this autumn, of course, but I think one has to count on looking at how to proceed in a situation where this might persist. And I think the only option we have then is to do what is now being done in relation to the appellate body, for instance, finding other solutions that still maintains as much as possible of what the global trading system and the WTO stands for. Of course, if this will go on for a longer period of time, it will be very, very difficult. I think the systemic power structure is presently such that there is no leader. It's evident that China is not able to lead as the US did after the war. You brought up the issue of democracy versus non-democracies, and it was probably easier to maintain this system during a period in which there were basically democracies running the systems without having authoritarian influence in the way we see now from larger and major trading nations. But that's besides the point, because we have to work with what we have. And I think the solution has to be to stay the course, move forward where it's possible, go plurilateral. I think Pasi made excellent arguments for why those countries resisting plurilateral agreements should rethink their positions. And of course, plurilateral solutions to the largest extent possible should be on an MFN basis, if not all of them. So that I think is key to the future. And also the proposals for reform that many of you have mentioned will be of great importance to work on. I know that my government will be trying to contribute by gathering some thinkers to see what we can do from our point of view. But all of this will, of course, be to a large extent dependent on what kind of American president we have after the elections, even though one should, of course, be aware of the fact that there might be non-trade positive measures and policies coming out also from a new US administration. Thank you.
Thank you, Anders. Bernard? Bernard, yes. Are you there? Yeah.
I'm here.
Please, over to you.
So what are you looking for?
I raised two questions in terms of the US intransigency and whether we could move the WTO forward without the US. And the fact is that the US is a very bad international citizen. It is not even in the Climate Change Convention, for example, as passed out. And how do you progress WTO in a situation, number one? Number two is, under the legal text of the WTO, voting is possible, except that there was an agreement, a gentleman's agreement to follow a consensus rule. So if we are talking about democracies, then is it possible that the voting could also be done at a later stage in order to ensure that things don't get jammed or they don't get sort of, fixated on one particular. Appellate body is a classic example of one country holding the whole system hostage.
Yeah. So on the US, clearly, if the US is not inside the tent, the value of the WTO is going to erode a lot. On the other hand, I think the TPP experience shows that, and it goes back to the leadership point, that it doesn't mean that everything falls apart, right? So I think it is incumbent upon governments to say, okay, we will go ahead without the United States. So this is obviously under the assumption that Trump gets reelected. But the value of the system obviously is going to be much declined if the United States is not part of it. But at the same time, you can also make the same case for the other large countries. So it does come back to the large countries getting together and dealing with some of these systemic issues. And so far, I would argue, yes, there are some green shoots to be observed, but it's not happening in Geneva. And some important large countries are completely missing from the debate. And that includes your country, and your country is an important one. So again, I wouldn't just point at the US alone. On the voting issue, it's very clear that WTO members are just constitutionally opposed to voting. Yes, the option is there, but they don't want to use it. And I think they haven't been wanting to use it for very good reasons. I think the one area where I was thinking there might be some scope to differentiate in terms of voting is on the type of issues, to distinguish between substantive results of negotiations that alter rights and obligations, and where I would argue we absolutely need consensus to ensure that small countries don't get steamrollered and that everybody is comfortable in joining whatever is the outcome of a negotiation, and to distinguish that from operational matters. Right, so some of the things that had to do with the appellate body were just operational issues, right? So I think there should be, and I would argue, ideally there would be more of an inclination to think about voting. We asked this question in the survey, where we made it very clear that we were not talking about voting on substance, but voting on day-to-day business, kind of the operational, institutional dimensions. And it's very clear that even for that, there is not much support, right? So it's not going to happen. And again, this is a discussion that's been going on for decades. And I think that's the reason we're seeing the shift to plurilaterals. And I think that is going to be the direction of travel looking forward. And I think the challenge for the membership will be, what can they do on these plurilateral types of initiatives to make them look more like the trade facilitation agreement, right? So that we actually have everyone inside the tent, but it's very clear that a number of countries will not be able to comply immediately or even in the medium term, that there will be assistance and that there will be a process through which membership in these new agreements, which hopefully will be negotiated, will over time expand. Right, and I think there is a gap in the WTO today, because even though countries have gone down this plurilateral path, there is not a clear system, there is not a clear set of guidelines to which the signatories of these agreements will commit themselves with respect to how they will treat outsiders. Right, so there's a lot of presumption that, yes, we will not discriminate, or yes, if a country decides to join 10 years down the road, we will not make life more difficult for that country. But there's nothing there that you can go to court over. So I think for that process to work, we need much more in the way of commitments by those who are inclined to pursue plurilaterals to take into account the concerns of countries that are not part of them at the beginning. Let me end there.
Thank you, Bernard. Just to respond to you in terms of, there has been a change of policy stance in India in terms of international trade. They're becoming more and more inward-looking than they were in the past. Now, there is a very strong conflict of opinion within the top echelons of the government. But the fact is that those who are prevailing are dictating the factors. I mean, there was an issue, somebody raised a question of why did India not sponsor a person for the DG's job? And we have some good candidates, but I don't think India was very keen to get into the process. With that, over to Marion. Marion, over to you.
Do you hear me now?
Yeah.
I would like to say something to the first question. How can we move forward without the United States if necessary? First, I would like to point out that the situation of the United States accepting the WTO dispute settlement system until now, recognizing it, was an exception rather than the rule. To my knowledge, the United States doesn't recognize any international dispute settlement system, at least not in the public. So pulling out of the WTO could be considered to be somehow going to a normality for the United States and may not only be linked to the name of the current president. It is something that is in line with what the United States has been doing. The United States has found it much easier to recognize instruments of private international law. That's one reason why I think that the linkages between international public law and international private law could be something to be explored more further in order to pull the interest of the United States more back into the multilateral trading system. So the United States not being part of an international system, that's something we know from other forums, and we can maybe learn from other forums where the international community has been able to advance without the United States on how these things can happen. Second point, also the fact that the United States feels now more nervous about a multilateral trading system may not only be the case because of who is currently the president of the United States. Historically, whenever a hegemon suddenly started to be threatened by another hegemon, things change, equilibria change, everything is going to be redefined. When the trade tensions between the United States and China started a few years ago, I argued that it would be important for the international community to guarantee two things. First, to ensure that the existing building blocks of the multilateral trading systems are not destroyed. I expected that we would have to enter into a laying low phase before the new large powers find a new equilibrium and go back to the multilateral trading system. First thing, make sure that none of the building blocks is going to be destroyed. That didn't work. The appellate body is dysfunctional now. Second thing to be aware of, avoiding Cold War scenarios. That would be a lose-lose for everybody, in particular, the smaller countries of the system, in particular, also including the medium-sized powers. There are several signals, in particular in the new technology world, that we are moving towards Cold War scenarios. I would like to invite all players to find ways to avoid this, and plurilateral approaches, as Bernard mentions too, discussions between the larger countries, the larger economies in or outside of Geneva are elements that can contribute to this. I would expect and I would hope for a dynamic system of iterative processes with different samples of countries that keep the discussion going and hopefully move us back to a new, stronger and sustainable multilateral trading system.
Thank you, Marion. May I request Caroline? 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 Yeah.
Sorry, I couldn't unmute myself. Actually, I think enough has been said by the others. I don't think I need to add to that point.
Thank you very much. Veena?
Member of the climate change negotiations would be a very big handicap in meeting the obligations, in kind of helping the countries to become operational. The second thing that I wanted to say is that this is just a short response to Caroline. When talked about the problems, I completely agree that these problems exist. But whether trade is the mechanism to address is something that I've doubted all my career, and I doubt it still, because not much has been achieved through trade in terms of sustainable development, but a lot has been achieved through countries' own policies unrelated to trade regarding sustainable development. So that's my response to that. And whether plurilaterals are the way to go, I suppose it's a default position. It's not the desirable position, but it is the default position. And how plurilateral benefits would be extended to all without the large countries participating is something that I'm not clear on. Because a lot has been said on free riders as well, and has been written on free riders. And a plurilateral is essentially something where benefits would be extended, but obligations would not be undertaken. That was my understanding. But if that is the case and large countries are not a part of the plurilaterals, the system will get very unbalanced. So this is my response to
Veena, to answer my question in terms of democracy within the WTO, voting is legally allowed, but by tradition, they have stayed away from voting. Number one. Number two is, if the US has held the WTO mortgage, and Trump has threatened many times to walk out of the WTO as it has walked out of the WHO or climate change or TPP or what have you. So how do you think we can take the WTO forward for the benefit of all the other members of the world, of the organization?
If the US walks out, the fulcrum will be EU and China. And so countries aligned with these would expect to benefit from the WTO. But that would be a very undesirable situation in my view. Even with the three of them, the US, EU, and China being members of the WTO, the FTAs are centered around these three countries today. And all the allies of these three countries get to benefit more than the WTO, than the other members of the WTO. So what I'm saying is that the US walking out or not walking out, the fulcrum would always be around the three countries. And whether US is a member of the WTO or not, it continues to be the largest market for a number of countries. The thing is that the other countries, smaller countries, would have much less leverage than they do with the WTO system. And that is a major issue. And that will be a major issue because there is no leverage that the smaller countries could exercise. In the WTO system, they have some leverage, which they wouldn't have with US walking out of the system. Then it would be a free-for-all and also dominated by EU and China. That is my... And on the first thing on whether we should resort to voting or not, I think it will depend very much on the issues concerned. I mean, consensus was a very good principle for keeping the smaller states engaged. But there are a number of issues on which the smaller states have no interest. And given that, I think issue-wise, one can decide whether there should be voting or not. That undermines multilateralism in a big way, and that I'm completely in agreement. But on the other hand, what do you need to do to push ahead multilateralism would be to give small concessions like that on an issue basis.
Thank you, Veena. I just wish to respond to one of the points raised by both Veena and Caroline. And this is a tragedy which continues to happen, that sustainable development is not synonymous with environment. Sustainable development also includes equity and economy. And if you look at the SDGs agenda, so let's stop abusing sustainable development to be only environment, and that is what will cover a large number of the developing world. May I, Pasi, are you there?
Yes, I'm here. Hang on a second. Well, as others have spoken already, I thought I wasn't perhaps it was perhaps not necessary for me to take the floor anymore. But on the decision-making side, I would tend to agree with Bernard that it's probably not happening anytime soon in the WTO. But I think it could be looked at in situations where the issue to be decided has little in terms of impact on your individual rights and obligations. I mean, for instance, on the WTO DG, I mean, whoever is chosen, it doesn't really have a particular impact necessarily on your present rights and obligations anyway. So there, in the end, you could envisage voting. Another issue where you could envisage more voting would be, I mean, if the members could look into the issue of interpretation of the agreements. I mean, sometimes, as Bernard, I think, pointed out, there have been problems with the fact that you have gotten appellate body rulings that seem not to be deriving from what was sort of intended through the particular rules of an agreement. And I think you could sort of try to increase that sort of interpretation work of members as a whole. I mean, it requires still 3/4 majority, so it's a big majority to accomplish, but at least it would make it possible for the members to deliberate a bit as to what was agreed when they agreed it. On the US, I just want to point out that I mean, the US is very much involved in both the e-commerce and the fishery subsidies negotiations. So there are items that the US is interested in, and I think being able to engage with the US on these sort of topics, and possibly, at some stage you could come up with a cooperative effort to address the policy actions causing damaging spillovers, as Bernard was mentioning. I mean, there are things that we probably would be able to get the US attention. I think overall, it's not clear to me that the US economy has mightily benefited from the current trade policies that they have undertaken. So perhaps at some point they might start reflecting on as to what is actually beneficial for the US economy as a whole, where trade plays not an important part, but it's still there. So let's see how things evolve, regardless of who is in the house. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Pasi. And now over to Bipul for the vote of thanks and the last word. Bipul, over to you. Bipul, over to you.
Thank you. So it's time to say a few words at the end. All excellent suggestions. I think it was an excellent deliberation. And we have made a note of all these suggestions on what needs to be done and how they could be done. I have no intention to summarize them for various reasons. One of them being that we are already overshot the time by several minutes. Therefore, let me do it in a brief manner by posing a couple of questions which are coming to my mind, not just out of today's deliberation, but for quite some time. One is that who is going to do all this? I mean, who is going to make these demands? Are we capable? Do we have the capacity? Or perhaps more interesting, more importantly, are we interested? And by we mean business, civil society, as well as governments. I have a feeling that the more and more we become digital, this new way of doing trade, I think there is not going to be much interest in the existing rules and regulations, particularly when nobody can stop me because the dispute settlement system is not there. It's not functioning from doing what I wanted to do. So far, we have not gone above the upper limit of the tariffs. I don't think that is also needed because countries have realized that it's not needed. If I want to stop import, I can do it in various other manner possible. I don't have to increase my tariff, as simple as that. That brings me to my second and final point, which is the question which you have posed for this series of webinars. What would happen to a world without the WTO? Let me put it this way. I mean, is WTO is it there? I mean, maybe there on paper as far as the building is there, and also the agreements are there. But in terms of functions, I'm not very sure whether it is already there or not. So that's the bigger question that we need to understand. And somehow I get a feeling that we are exactly going back by a century, few years before and after the First World War. And we all know what happened. At that time, though, no multilateral system was there. And we may not see that kind of a war, I hope not, but a different kind of gunboat diplomacy kind of a situation is likely to appear. I mean, that's a pessimistic thinking, I admit that, but perhaps that's where we are heading towards. And I'll end by taking you back by a year, summer of 2019. There was a big interview in Financial Times by Vladimir Putin, President of Russia. And the headline was, "Liberal ideas are obsolete." And nobody opposed that. No world leader had opposed that. As a matter of fact, many countries since then, even before that and since then, are becoming more and more illiberal. So I would end by posing a question. Is it possible to have a system, a functioning system, having two entirely different types of governance, both in political and in economic sense? So I don't know the answer. Perhaps we need to deliberate more to find a possible answer. But one possibility which is definitely emerging is that, and that I think has been reinforced by this COVID pandemic, that we are going to see a more and more chaotic world. And I don't think that I think, let me put it this way, I think today we need not just one, but a number of John Maynard Keynes. I don't think we have even one as we speak. So with this, let me thank all of you, Anders, Marion, Pasi, Veena, Bernard, and all our participants, Pradeep for this excellent moderation, Caroline, of course. And what we are going to do at the end of this webinar series, this is the fifth and final one, we are going to come out with a discussion paper. It's not going to be another huge volume which nobody is going to read. It's just about 4,000 to 5,000 words. And we're going to send that to you for your review. And hopefully we'll be able to contribute at least to stop this slippery slope. It's very, very slippery. And I'll end by saying that not just in traditional sense, but in every other sense of the term, our security is under threat. And that is the most important global public good that we can have. So unless WTO becomes a multilateral, not just WTO, the multilateralism becomes functional again, I think we are going to enter into a decade, may not be decade of 2020s, maybe decade of 1920s as well. So let me stop here. Thank you. Thank you.
With that, goodbye to everyone. And let me also thank all of you personally for having participated most brilliantly in this webinar. And I'm sure the results will come out pretty well when we draft. And also to inform everybody that the webinars have been recorded and the video would be available on our website if should anybody would like to go back and see. Thank you very much. Goodbye to all.
Bye.